Thank all of you for coming. I can see a few of the usual suspects. I always make it a point of duty to come to all our events. We thank you, and we also thank new faces. We always look forward to having new faces in our conversations. Please note that this conversation, this period is quite informal, and it's basically a question and answer time with our speakers. And I'll ask them a few questions to kind of raise up the issues that we're trying to look at. And after both speakers have had a go at it, then we'll open it up to the audience for their questions and their thoughts. If you have a question, please just raise up your hand, and then I will point at you, and then you can ask your question or make your comment. Any points of clarification? Okay, so let me start by introducing our speakers. First, we have Dr. Shose Khessi. She's a senior lecturer at the Department of Psychology in UCT. And I would make the case that she's one of the continent's leading decolonial scholars. We were just having a discussion outside, and she was telling me how in the space of 3 days, she's going to speak in 3 different continents. So that tells you how busy she is. She's currently the deputy dean in the faculty, in charge of transformation in the humanities faculty. She graduated from the London School of Economics and Political Science, where she obtained her doctorate degree in organizational and social psychology. Her research interests are psychological research into identity and difference, especially with regards to race and gender in the African context. Her key focus at the moment is on the development of photo voice methodology as a participatory action research tool to raise consciousness and mobilize groups in social action. That's a mouthful, but it's basically short for saying she does a lot of community psychology work. And in line with her work, she's done a lot of consultation for national governments and NGOs. She's currently the founding member and first chairperson of the UCT Black Academic Caucus. And she's serving on the VC Special Executive Task Team since 2016. Dr. Shose is also a polyglot. She's fluent in English, French, and Swahili. And I'm sure a few other local South African languages. So I have probably like 6 languages under her belt. Please let's welcome her. Dr. Afton is, well, soon to be doctor, actually. She's rounding up her PhD. She's a senior lecturer in the commercial law department, so I'm sure some of you are familiar with her face. She graduated from UCT with a Bachelor of Commerce and Bachelor of Laws degree. She completed her articles and then was admitted to the High Court as an attorney and notary and conveyancer. She practiced as a tax attorney at Cliff Decker Hoffmeyer for 2 years, providing tax and exchange control advice to multicultural and multinational clients. She's completed her master's in commercial in taxation from UCT, and she joined the commercial law department in 2011. She's rounding up her PhD at the University of Amsterdam, and her PhD focuses on designing a corporate tax and VAT system along with general anti-avoidance rule for East African Community proposed federation. Her research interest is generally in international tax law. So apart from the formal bio, my personal interaction with Afton was first at a conference, and I saw her speaking, and it was on tax, and I don't know anything about tax, it's not my area. And then I sat for her presentation, and I'd never seen anybody break down tax that way, in a way that it was so relatable to me. Tax just always seemed like something the government just took from us to increase their coffers, and then it was like, oh, it makes sense now. So after introducing our speakers, I'll proceed with the questions. Can you guys hear me at the back? I always like to think that I have a speaker in between my chest, so I hope that is true. Ma'am Doris, can you hear me? So I'll start with the first question to Dr. Shose. And the question is, in the recent years, there's a lot of discussion around decolonization, and everybody asks, what does it mean? What do we mean by decolonization? How do you decolonize a curriculum that has been more or less set in stone for decades, and ways of knowing are very, very strict and conservative? How then do you decolonize knowledge, and how do you then decolonize the curriculum?
Okay, thanks. Thank you, for that way too generous introduction. I don't know, I hope you can hear me. I'm struggling with the chest issue, so just tell me if you can't hear me. So I think that we've heard the term decolonization a lot, and also we've heard the term decolonial a lot. And I want to speak to what those things mean, but first I also want to say that when we're talking about change and transformation, there's lots of discourse out there and lots of terminology out there. Sometimes we hear things like inclusion, equity, diversity, difference, and especially when we are in universities that are quite liberal, that have liberal outlooks, often we talk about issues of racism and gender discrimination under this discourse that speaks about inclusion and difference and equity, and it's hard to then pinpoint what we actually mean. Whereas I think what was very refreshing in 2015 when Rose Musfall arrived at this institution is that they started shifting that discourse and started talking about decolonization. And to me, it's very clear. I mean, decolonization, there's the word colonization in it. It's about addressing colonial relations of power. And we all know what those colonial relations of power are. They have to do with issues around race, gender, class, or in other words, capitalism, patriarchy, racism. And, oh, thanks. And so for me, I really welcome that kind of shift in the discourse, because it often when we start talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity, we run the risk of losing track of actually the fundamental issues that we need to address in this university. Things like racism, things like centering Africa in our project. And I would say that often when I hear people say, I don't really understand what decolonization means, I'm often surprised, because we are located in a historical context where we are living every day the impact of colonization and apartheid. Right? And perhaps the issue rather is that we are positioned differently in society. So some people are living that impact a lot more, it's a lot more visible, it's a lot more felt, and in everyday experiences of life. So I would say, the project of decolonization is about addressing the impact of colonization and how it transpires through our everyday experiences. And in an academic institution like this, it has to do with what we are taught, what we learn, how people relate to each other, who is hired by the institution, who is in the positions of power, who remains in kind of, who are the workers, who are the lecturers, who are the senior managers, etc. Those kinds of questions. But I think what's very interesting, and the part of your question speaks to curriculum, right? And so what's very interesting is how do we now, what is related to that question is interrogating, well, what is the role of the institution? What is the role of the university? Why do we come here? What are we trying to achieve? And in my view, this is where the concept of the decolonial becomes important, because it's like, yes, we are inheriting, we are placed in institutions that are very Western in their outlook. We've inherited that. And what that meant is that often our academic projects, whether it's law or psychology or anthropology or engineering or whatever it might be, they have been kind of crafted and designed to serve the interests of the dominant in society. So questions like, should engineers, be thinking about establishing big dams somewhere, or should we rather be maybe thinking about how do we change the townships that we live in? So it's those kinds of questions. In psychology, which is my field, the history of psychology is very dubious. There was a lot of work into things like IQ, intelligence testing, and early 19th century work in psychology looked at differences in IQ between races, and it created a kind of body of knowledge that legitimized notions of black people being inferior in relation to other races. And these are things that creep into our everyday lives and everyday discourses. When I did a project with black students a few years ago on their experiences at the university, a lot of things that they said to me was about feeling that they were taking the place of white students. There was a whole discourse around low standards, the increase in black students coming to UCT, the response was one of, it's going to bring the standards down of the university, etc. Well, that discourse, you can very much trace it back to these kind of academic projects that legitimize certain ways of being and thinking. So I think our role as a university is to think about what is it that we want to achieve. I mean, isn't the academic project supposed to be about changing society? We need to question like the relevance of our disciplines. How do they serve social justice? How do they serve the creation of a more equal or egalitarian society? I think I'll leave it there.
You mentioned, do you have anything you want to add? You mentioned a very important point, and I want to hint my second question on that, on how the academic project is about changing society. So I guess my question then is, when we say society, what do we mean by society? Is it defined as Pan-African? Is it defined as local? And if it is local, how local? Or is it even international? Or is it a combination of all three? What society are we trying to change? And then I guess that would then somewhat determine the focus that we place.
Okay, so that's a really nice question. And I think we simultaneously, when I talk about everyday kind of experiences, I think that's fundamental, right? So we need to transform our everyday lives. And so we have to understand as a university what context we are in. And here we are in Cape Town, the Western Cape. It's a very different context compared to even if you just go to Johannesburg, right? And so I think that our disciplines, or what we learn here, needs to address that local context. But in doing that, we also don't live outside of a global environment. Right? So there was sometimes the example I give is when I talk about the social psychology of HIV/AIDS, for instance. So we know that HIV is a significant problem in South Africa, but we need to understand it in relation to a globalized environment. So decisions about, we know, for instance, that HIV has been prevalent in particular areas, and if we look at the conditions of those areas, so it can, for example, be in mining communities, because in mining communities, men often have to leave their families and they are located in a particular place, which leads to a particular set of social conditions where HIV is, as a health issue emerges, right? And that's a historical fact, because that's how the mining industry was so central to the apartheid project. But then we also think about, well, these mining companies, they are global. So decisions about labor practices can be made in Geneva or wherever it is. So there's always that link between the local context and the global context. And I think our role in academia is to actually understand those things, and so that, developing critical consciousness to understand I can intervene in my space and do something positive in my space, but there's always a point at which I need to understand that there's a global context where that limits or that creates possibilities for academic projects. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. I guess the next question is, so you made the link between the local and the global. Would you say there's also a link between the immediate local and the continental, in this case Africa? So I, as a Nigerian who may or may not go back home, when I everything I do here in UCT, is it with the context of taking the lessons and then applying it back home, knowing fully well that what I'm learning is in the South African context and my engagement is from the position of being an outsider, or even while I'm here, I become an insider, and then I'm just an insider that is part of a larger insider in the African context. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that part of your question that you sent me beforehand was about Pan-Africanism and what does that mean. And I think there's different ways that Pan-Africanism is kind of used and understood. So in some ways it's a geopolitical project. It's about identity, it's about location, it's about geography. It's also a temporal project because it emerged obviously at a particular historical moment. And I think, yes, when we are being located in South Africa, we cannot be what's the expression, an island of prosperity, right, in the continent. And necessarily, there are these borders that we have. They were created and designed at a particular time, and I think it's important that we interrogate that. And when we think about, some of the issues around xenophobia that are happening, we need to question why and what does that actually mean, who belongs here. So there's all of those types of identity issues. And I think that what we can draw from the Pan-African movement is aspirational, right? So it's aspirational in the sense that it created a movement for resistance against colonization. But what we can also draw from it is an understanding of how complex that is and how difficult it actually is in reality to create solidarity between nations who have very different agendas sometimes and needs, the need to cater for your own population. And so I think it's very complex. There was something else I was going to mention. Yeah, I can't remember. If it comes back to me.
It comes back to you. So it's funny the way you answer, because it actually ties into the questions that I had prepared to ask you. And my probably the most important question, I think, against all of this, then is, based on everything you said, if someone were to ask you point blank, is UCT a South African university that caters to South Africans and international students, or it is an international university that just happens to be located in Cape Town? Especially considering the history of the institution itself, how it was initially just white only, and the issues of institutional racism, and how there are now constant and concerted efforts to open up spaces that have previously been closed. Would you say that UCT is or can be either or?
An African university or a Pan-African?
Whichever one. So it's literally, it's an open-ended question.
Okay. I would like to say that, UCT is an African university, because I would say that any knowledge that is produced in Africa or about Africa is African. And that's a very simplistic in a way answer. But of course, when we dig deeper and see actually what it is that we teach here and research here, then the question becomes a bit more complex. And I have questions like, how is it possible that in a university in Africa, that's supposedly the best university on the continent, the only African language we offer as a major is isiXhosa. It's the only one. How is that possible? We have a Center for African Studies that is highly underfunded. We have I think they have 1.7 members of academic staff in African studies. So of course that leads to questions, and I'm interested to hear from the audience actually about what they think UCT is. Is it an African university? Is it a Pan-African university? And then related to the point that I wanted to make earlier is, why is it that we haven't, for instance, solved the problem of malaria? What is it that students are being taught or researchers are doing in health sciences in Africa that has not led to a solution for malaria? Why haven't economists solved the problem of poverty on this continent? So those kinds of questions. I know I'm being very crude, but it's just to invite some kind of reflection on what does it actually mean to be located here and to call ourselves an African university.
So, if I get you right, what you're saying is the ideal is that it should be an African university. There are steps that need to be taken to make that a reality. And so my final question to you then is, in line with those goals of making it an international university, what would you say is the role of the international student population with regards to involvement? So for example, during Rose Must Fall, it was a largely Black South African-led movement. And so in this kind of political struggles and social struggles, what do you think is the role of the international community as allies or as stakeholders in the system? What would you say should, and even international staff, because the international staff population is also rising. So if you say it should be an African university, should policies be created that make that a reality, and implementation and lived realities of people who interact with the university?
I think there are many different theories of how change happens in institutions. And I would say that yes, student movements like the one we witnessed, Rose Must Fall, Fees Must Fall, is fundamental to change. And because when we're in these very big bureaucracies that have policies and systems that are very rigid and not very flexible, it's hard to change that from the inside. And so the a big movement is actually what is often required to kind of spark that change. But at the same time, it's unsustainable. We can't have like a constant physical form, right? Because otherwise we can't function as a university. So we also need other things happening. And I think that the way in which we can shift policies is definitely through student involvement in particular processes. I mean, we have an SRC, we have student representation on different bodies and committees. Maybe it's not working that well, but it is there and it exists, right? But I also think, so there's this bottom-up approach around student movement, student involvement. There's a top-down approach, so management also has to be willing to listen, understand, change, and respond. But then there's also the issue of, do we actually have a shared vision? Do we have shared values about the direction in which we want this university to go? And I think that's a key thing that needs to be addressed. And definitely, participation is key in change. So we need networks of support, we need allies. I think, I do believe, from my involvement with the Black Caucus some years ago and the relationship we had with students for a period of time, it was very effective. And we also joined, we also had relationships with the workers. So there was students, there was workers, there was academics, participating together in some kind of effort. And I think that was quite effective for a short time. And those things are needed. And then there's a whole set of other people, the alumni, funders, who are very important actors or stakeholders in an institution, who also need to come on board with this project of change and the ideas that and share some kind of common vision with us about where we want the university to go. So I think, yes, change is slow, but particularly in these big bureaucratic institutions, it's slow. But I also feel very confident about what we've seen over the past few years and the impact it has had and the gains, just in terms of having this conversation. It wouldn't have happened a few years ago, I don't think. So I do think that we also have to remember to bank our gains and build on what's happening.
Thank you very much. So I guess almost to I wouldn't presume to summarize what you said, but I get the sense that what you're saying is what is needed is stakeholders from at the different tiers, at different levels, coming together to create some sort of unified vision of where we're headed. And if that then is the case, then there's the possibility of creating that kind of university where everybody feels like they have a stake and their voice matters. I think that's what you're Afton, I mean, we know the problems of law.
Yes.
I mean, law as we know, it's the product of the colonial heritage. So a country's law system will be dependent on who colonized it. So if it's common law, it will be because it was colonized by the British. And in the case of South Africa, it's a combination of common law and Roman Dutch law.
Yes.
So what would you say is, for law that is quite black letter, quite set in stone, what would you say is likely to look, what would a decolonized law look like? Especially considering the history.
Yes, so when I consider a broad question like this, I have a very pragmatic approach to open-ended questions like this. So in my view, when we talk about decolonization, particularly decolonization of the law, I have in mind a process. So I have in mind that you evaluate all the possible options to a particular legal problem, and typically that would be an area that is unsettled in the law. And you evaluate all of the options wherever they may originate, in Africa or otherwise. But the decolonization comes in at the last step, and that is when you filter all of those possible options through an African context. So you may think to yourself, that's lovely, Afton, but how do you actually do that in a classroom? What I have in mind then is you take these options and you ask the questions. How can this work in Africa? And why should it work in Africa? And that gives you the African context. So when you can do this in the classroom or the boardroom, and fundamentally this process has in mind an adaptation of what we currently have, not an overhaul. Because people can adapt, but they can't unlearn what they've already learned. So you adapt what they have to what is suited for Africa. Having said that, decolonization is not a one-way street. It can't just come from the lecturer, from the podium. It's a lived process. It's also the student's responsibility to take what is given from the podium and to apply it to your circumstance. Now, I'm a tax lawyer. I'm going to give you a tax example. Okay, so bear with me. From the podium, I can tell you that we will tax income. What that is, it's a receipt in your hand that you've worked for. It's designedly sought and worked for. I can also tell you we don't tax loan receipts. Why? Because when you receive that money, you have an immediate obligation to pay back the same amount. Okay? So there is nothing to tax. Now, this is what I tell you. The decolonization process continues when you take it home with you and you apply it to a labola arrangement. And you ask, that receipt that is received by the bride's family, was that designedly sought and worked for? Is that not income? Or is it in the nature of a loan repayment because they paid for this young woman's education to make her where she is? Are they not now being reimbursed for that amount? So decolonization doesn't just come from me, from podium, from the lecture, it comes from the student as well. It's a two-way process.
Thank you very much for that answer. So with regards to the podium, so because that's your area of expertise, how do you teach the law? How do you teach tax law, for example? That I mean, we know by anecdotal evidence that we had tax systems prior to the, systems of paying the king, something. But how do you teach the law? When you set up your curriculum at the beginning of the year, do you teach it with the mindset of I'm teaching the law with regards to how South African law on tax works? Or I try to make it contemporaneous and comparative? What's your approach, and what do you think is the approach that helps to create that African lens of law that you were speaking about?
Okay, so the beauty of tax, of course, is that it's quite international. So we do have a whole area of law just called international tax, and it's not founded in a particular jurisdiction. There's that. So when we teach that, of course, it's not just South African. When we teach South African domestic tax, then of course all of the provisions would be South African. Having said that, even those provisions are not purely South African. We borrow extensively from other jurisdictions. So when you talk about South African law, it's not really South African law. It's law that we copied and pasted from somewhere else. So for example, our capital gains tax regime is not homebred. It's copied and pasted from Australia, wholesale. We have an entire big schedule that reads like nothing like the rest of the Act because we have adopted the interpretation of the Australian courts. So in tax, it's very difficult to call something entirely home-based because there is no such thing.
So would you then say that it should be home-based?
Well, its application is obviously home-based. It will be with the people who are citizens of South Africa who have an obligation to pay that tax. So I don't think it should be home-based. We live in a global world. So people are mobile, people are interconnected. International tax is becoming a very big problem because we are working on very old rules that were developed in the 1970s. Times with that, they never considered that people would become so mobile. So definitely, I don't think that we should center it in one jurisdiction.
And then when you teach it, do you think that that teaching should be at the postgrad level, or even at the undergrad level?
I think that we should teach it at the undergraduate level. I think it should be taught on day one, right side, alongside FIRAC. What you're actually doing with this decolonization lens is you are asking students to think critically, to take what is given to them and to adapt it, to change it, to mold it to their own experience of the law. And I think that takes time. In the same way that we allow 4 to 5 years for students to understand how to source the law, how to find the law, how to construct a coached argument, I think we should allow the same amount of time for them to critically analyze what is given to them as the law and how it can be molded to become a truly African example of the law.
I have just one more question with regards to that last point you made. And so do you think that that way of teaching the law should be a product of personal interrogation? So you have come to your conclusion from the point of view of your worldview. Do you think it should be an institutional way of doing things, or it should be student-led or staff-led, or at what point do you think that way of teaching the law should emanate, or you think it should be a combination of all those factors?
I think it should be a combination. I think if it's staff-led, there of course is the risk that it won't be received as it is intended. If it's student-led, of course there's a risk on the other side that people would also not receive it that way. If you have a combination, I think that would be more effective.
Thank you very much. I don't want to take up all the time, and so I hope that there are questions or comments. Oh, we already have one hand up. Maybe we can take 3 questions and comments, and then we'll have another round of. So, Professor Ada first. Anybody else? Okay, we'll let Professor Ada go then.
I didn't come with a question, but as I listened, the question popped up in my mind, and I just thought I would put it out there. So, just to preface it a bit, when we think about the identity of a university and of this city, which is what the topic is about, I'd like to sort of refer to a big country like the US that is so diverse and that has different kinds of universities. Not because we necessarily need to copy what's going on there, but because it gives sufficient examples for me to locate my question. So you have the big names like Harvard, Cornell, Ivy Leagues, that people come from all over the world. Then you have community colleges that cater to people that live next door. And you have so many others, and there's a category that can define itself by its sporting excellence in a particular area, or even by its, international student support. I know there's a university, Harrisburg in Virginia, where my brother teaches, where the university is denoted by its support for putting through papers for international students, supporting them in their applications for visas and so on. And so they have a very strong cohort from Asia and from other places that are not the US. And there's so many others. But I give this background to demonstrate that universities are not don't have a homogeneous identity that must then be directed towards a local, predominantly local population, or predominantly African or international or whatever. So there are different types. When you come to Africa, you find that typically universities, Nigeria, with which I'm very familiar, tend to be universities three levels: federal government, university, state government, and private universities. And in respect to all three categories, I have not noticed that any one of them represents the demographic of the country in proportion to the population of each group. You will find that people from all the 36 states of the country will be in any given university, but not in the same proportion to which they constitute the population, right? So, just thinking as you can see, interviewed and as the speaker spoke, I remember that it's been said a number of times that not just with regard to UCT, but other universities in South Africa and so on, that it's got to be reflective of the demographics of the country. So I wonder what anyone state speakers or those listening think what is the meaning of the demographics of the country? Does it mean predominantly those based in the Western Cape, or the country as a whole, South Africa, or does it mean that that's what UCT wants to be? And how does that kind of decision get taken? And is it perhaps an indication that there is now need, to sit together and actually determine, as policies are being churned out in all kinds of areas, what character we see the University of Cape Town as, what character it should have, taking into consideration the needs of transformation, internationalization, all the global changes happening as well. So I hope the question has come through. But so what do we think, UCT, what should be UCT's character, primarily to the speakers, and then, anybody else?
In terms of the decisions about what the demographic of the student population at UCT is, I think those hard questions that you raised are being decided today. There are people making those hard decisions, they're just not spoken of. And we don't actually know well, at least I don't know what the criteria is in the most part as to why we have a particular cohort that's 25% and another is 50%. So in that lacuna, there is the very real reality that most of us should be having this conversation, but in fact we're not. And thank you for raising that, because I think that this is a point of further discussion that perhaps other people haven't thought about, but this is something we should be talking about.
Okay, thanks for that question. Maybe one way to just not really answer it, but speak to it is, when I think about Rose must fall and Peace must fall and how it happened in this institution and across the country, I think that there's a very close link between Black South African students coming into institutions at higher learning, and that the increasing demographic actually then leading to challenging the institution and what happens in universities. I don't think that we can separate demographics from curriculum change and all of these other things that we're talking about. And so, to me, in some ways, yes, the issue of representation is critical, not just among students, but among staff too. If we're going to be serious about producing knowledge from an African perspective, we need to have scholars who can actually deliver that. And I do think it's highly important that we think about what does that mean? I mean, what does it mean? To me, it always comes back to that fundamental question of what is the university for? And we can't really compare it to, it's a public institution, it's supposed to serve people, And so what is it for? And you know, in my view, it should be about producing knowledge that is socially just, producing knowledge that is going to create a more egalitarian society, all of these things. And so it's very much linked to who is part of the institution, what knowledge is going to be produced.
Anybody else? Apart from Jamila?
Thank you very much to our speakers. So I think my question...
Could you please just raise your voice?
Sure. I think I've got a question for each of you, but I think that there's a central theme, I think, in both my questions about the role of the university in decolonization. I think and I think how I want to frame it is decolonization versus decolonizing the curriculum. And so maybe for Shose, I was wondering whether you think we as academics in this institution and in other institutions, do we lead or participate in decolonization because of our research and the impact of that research in our teaching and in society? In other words, do we use decolonizing the curriculum as a way to decolonize? Or is that a limited view of our role in the decolonization project? And then I think following from that for Afton, I think in decolonizing law as a lecturer, do you see my role and your role, all of our roles, as simply pointing out an African context as a point for critical analysis? Is that the extent of my role as a lecturer? And is that not a very limited view of what my role is as a lecturer to decolonize?
I think to answer your question, I would say one of the things that is happening at the moment in psychology, I'll speak from what I know. And a colleague of mine and the two of us started this project. It's called the Hub for Decolonial Feminist Psychologies in Africa. And for me, what was significant about this project, it was about, yes, changing the curriculum, but also the content of what we teach, how we teach, but also it's about research, the types of projects that we want to research, and the types of projects that existing psychological work that needs to be critiqued. And it's also about a fundamental aim of the hub is to create networks on the continent and to kind of research what is happening in other institutions on the continents when it comes to psychology. And in some ways, for me, I think it goes back to something that Afton was saying. It's like we've inherited this discipline that is being written about and taught in a particular way. And I don't want to venture and say that this is a Western discipline, because actually I'm not sure. The roots of our disciplines, sometimes we actually don't know the histories and where they actually come from. We often talk about our disciplines as being Western and European, and I think when I say that, what I'm saying is that it's because they serve a particular project and how they're being used and applied. But the actual roots of the knowledge, I don't know, it could have been, African or international, it could come from many places. So I'm skeptical about saying that psychology is not African, for instance. But I do think that our role in terms of critiquing, understanding, applying our work in an African context is about reflecting on decolonization and how certain forms of psychological work, like the one I gave an example on earlier, but also how psychologists have been involved in producing ideas about men and women, women as irrational and men as rational, and all these differences between men and women. And yes, and also the treatment, of so-called gender conditions. And so these things have been, these things need to be disrupted and critiqued, and I think that we can have a role in that as academics.
Thank you for your question. So when I spoke about the decolonization process, I mentioned that we would source different options from wherever they may originate, and then we critically analyze that in terms of an African context. So I think what that process would involve is, of course, you would have to find the African sources, which is already far different from what the students had complained of in the curriculum beforehand, that it was too Eurocentric, and so there wasn't enough of a base. I think through this process, you are broadening the base of knowledge in that you are sourcing things that are purely African and things that would be from other areas of the world. So critical analysis is one aspect of it, but the sourcing would be another aspect. And through the sourcing, it would inform the content, because once you're aware of that other area of law, you would be able to bring that into your own curriculum. So it's not as restricted as perhaps I described it, but there would be a great deal of room to make the decolonization process, I think, bigger and probably more organic than what we had before.
Any other questions or takes or suggestions? Nigel.
For Afton, you talked about international tax, and I was just wondering what it's like to talk about decolonization, but specifically in the context of globalization. So you're talking about like decolonization to a room of people, or maybe who aren't like particularly interested in it, also doesn't necessarily benefit them in any way to invest in that project. So, a lot of the international tax organizations have been critiqued for not changing the system. So, what is it like to go and present, talk or discuss or just deal with that kind of? Are people receptive to it?
Yes.
And not from the African continent?
They are generally. I think what is happening at the moment is that people are open to change a lot more than they have been before. And even in an international tax context, we're still basically talking about the same skill. We're talking about taking what you have, critically evaluating it, changing it to suit the circumstance. I mean, you can do that in any jurisdiction. So I think there's also been a movement just globally to critically evaluate the rules in international tax at the moment, because of course they were created in the 1970s. So increasingly there's a question, and thankfully a question coming from the South: is this appropriate? And the voices from the developing countries are becoming stronger. So watch the space. It's a very good space to be in.
Sorry, I don't know your name, sorry.
And also here in Chair this is follows on from what you're talking about. I mean, you're painting those sources are out there, and you can get them, and then you can assess them, keep them. Often things are not necessarily known. You have to descend into other ways of knowing how rules are made and who gets to make them and all of that. But that aside, I would be interested to hear your opinions about how, centering this on a kind of more legal question or issue, why wouldn't the practices govern how the laws should be made and created? So, for example, the way you approached in your opening talk, it was you have an issue or a problem, you see what the law says, and the various laws say according to the practice, and then you see which solutions will be available. What happens if the practices that are in play are provided for with the laws? So one example, and it's a very common example we hear about all the time, is something like what you call black tax, right? So you're a tax expert. In your teaching, do you teach about, or do you think about how obligations, customary obligations, if not not moral obligations, to family members, however defined, should be part of the tax system.
Yes, I do. I've actually co-written a paper on that that's currently being reviewed at the moment.
Okay.
Yes, so black tax is actually very interesting. So yes, I have thought about it and I do teach about it. I teach about it, but it's within the context of what the law is at the moment. Of course, tax law can only operate within legislation. So what I do is I take the law as it is and I postulate this to the class and I ask them, how do you think the law should apply in the circumstance? And there are particular rules in the Income Tax Act that prohibits that kind of thinking. And then I raise it to the class, how do you think we can overcome this? And ultimately the question comes down to you need to change the legislation. So we've identified which specific areas in the legislation are problematic from an African context, why black tax can't be implemented because of these provisions, and ultimately I have to wait for the class to build up a groundswell in practice, and basically you have to lobby legislation to be changed. So it is something that I've thought about, something I've written about, and I'm finding it's something that the class is quite passionate about.
Just to follow up on that issue, the socio-legal issue, not legal issue per se. So how do you define black tax then? I mean, in terms of not just your actual definition, how do you measure it?
That's a difficult thing. Of course, I'm a tax expert. I don't want to mention the socio-economic aspects of delivering those sort of talks, but what I would have in mind is ultimately the definitions would be important. So we would have to take a broader scope of firstly what we understand family to be. It's not just blood relations. And then we'd have to talk about what exactly is the money being used for. So in the paper that we've written, what we proposed is that the money is actually going to be used towards fulfilling a state function, something that the state should be doing and is not. So paying for higher education, paying for quality hospital care, medical care, that would be something which a state is supposed to be fulfilling as its role, but it's not. So in the event that you have a South African taxpayer being required to fulfill that sort of role, that would qualify as black tax.
Professor Manju.
Isn't that pretty narrow? Because then you're taking a case-by-case approach in terms of who gets taxed because the state is failing in its obligations, but it's not changing the structural problem of a whole lot of other people who may not know that they could, argue this. Will litigation, a test case, actually force the current court to rethink the tax regime, to understand different family forms in Africa, including issues around the black tax, whether Lobola is a gift or an earning or whatever, because I don't like the connotation that it's an earning because you pay for your child's education, and now that, because it then kind of perpetuates stereotypes about women as property. So is there another way of having the discussion that does the decolonization, that forces the legislature as well as the courts to rethink the way we take international tax law, South African inherited colonized tax law, to rethink, but also talk about state responsibility and the failure of the state to actually provide what should be basic support services. But that wasn't my question. My question is about, sorry, my question is about UCT and the kind of language that this is a curriculum development thing that has to be black-led, right? So no definition of black-led, but black-led, which then raises many, many questions about assumptions that get made about black-led, that black-led means there's a certain level of experience, expertise, time, resources to do this. And on a cynical level, for me, when I see that kind of stuff, I immediately think for UCT it's about optics and it's about PR, black-led, because they're not putting in the support services, resources to enable black people who are now carrying a triple load in addition to their teaching, their research, doing the kind of work you're doing, to excavate and look at structure structural issues. Now you're also saying in this decolonization process, it has to be black-led. But there isn't an understanding by the institution that we're actually paying a price for that as black academics, and particularly in this university. I mean, it could be happening elsewhere. So, Shose maybe.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Rashida. I think often black academics take on the burden of transformation and do the extra work because I suppose they're directly invested in it, because then it has a direct impact on our not only survival but on our actual productivity here. So I think in some ways it's inevitable, and I think that you're right that because the university maybe does not pay sufficient, doesn't recognize that work sufficiently, it means that we do it at great personal cost. But I think that the flip side is not just that we have to be involved because we're investing in it, it's also about intellectual contribution that we make. And I feel like that's where the recognition needs to be. Is that I sometimes, in my experience of being in different spaces in the institution, you know, whether it's in these management meetings or whatever it might be, I get the sense that people don't know what to do. And so, in some ways, they need our input to say, this is what we think should happen and how. So I think that there is that intellectual contribution that is necessary, but I also agree that it needs to be supported and it needs to be recognized.
Any more questions, suggestions, points? That's about it. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. It's always great to have you at these sessions where we get to discuss a lot of things that we can't discuss in the classroom. Thank you very much for coming. And thank you very much to our panelists. It was really great to have you. I know both of you are quite busy, and for being able to squeeze us in, really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Please, another round of applause for our panelists. On that note, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much for coming.